Hi there. I'm Patrick Denice, an assistant professor in the Sociology Department in the Faculty of Social Science here at Western. Now, when I tell you I'm a sociologist, what comes to mind? If you're anything like me, when I first got to university, I had no idea what sociology was, or even that there was a discipline called sociology. I like thinking about a sociological imagination, a term coined by C. Wright Mills, a famous sociologist working in the mid-20th century. It describes the way that sociologists think about the world around them, and particularly the relationship between our own personal experiences and wider society. How do our personal experiences connect to the broader society in which we live? How and why are my experiences different than yours? Instead of asking what sociologists study, we might be better asking what we don't study. Sociology is a really diverse field. In fact, I initially chose sociology because I wanted to study a whole lot of different things. Professors here are particularly focused on social inequality. Why do some groups have better access to more advantages than others? Within that broad area, you'll find professors here who do research and teach about things like gender and racial disparities in education, in health, in work, patterns of immigration and family formation, law, crime, and policing, as well as in social policy. I want to focus today on sources of racial and ethnic inequality, and I'm going to draw on some material from an upper level course I teach here. Specifically, why are our cities so unequal and segregated? What role have institutions played in shaping or influencing those inequalities? I think it's fair to say that very few people these days would openly admit to being prejudiced against racial groups other than their own. For one measure of how individual prejudice has changed over time, we can look at individuals' willingness to intermarry, that is, to marry outside of their own racial group. In the US, a question like this carries a lot of baggage. For most of the US's history, marrying outside of your race was against the law. These laws persisted in many states until very recently, the late 1960s. Here from the Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan research organization that conducts public opinion polling, we can see that the percentage of those surveyed who would be very or somewhat opposed to a close relative marrying someone who is Black has dropped substantially over time. In the 1990s, a majority, about 63% of individuals opposed such marriages among their close relatives. By 2016, that number was down to 14%. Not perfect, but progress nonetheless. Here's another measure. The percentage of Americans who said they would not vote for a Black presidential candidate has also declined, from about a quarter in 1972 to just 4% in 2010. So again, we see some, though imperfect, progress by way of declining personal prejudice. Yet most people in the US tend to think that outright prejudice or individual discrimination is to blame for the striking racial disparities that persist today. Again from Pew. While under a quarter of all adults believe that discrimination built into laws and institutions is the bigger problem when it comes to discrimination against Black people in the US, a much higher proportion, 2 out of every 3 adults, believe that discrimination based on the prejudice of individuals is the bigger problem. Now, I'm not going to suggest that such outright discrimination on the part of individuals doesn't exist or isn't a problem anymore. It absolutely is. Indeed, according to a recent poll, 40% of all African Americans and nearly 6 in 10 African American men report that they've been personally experienced people acting afraid of them because of their race. Here in Canada, Black people are far more likely than any other racial group to be victims of hate crimes. And of course, we've seen an increase recently in anti-Asian discrimination and harassment during the pandemic, here in Canada, the US, and elsewhere. At the same time, it's important to recognize the role played by institutions. The laws, policies, political bodies, cultural life, schools, corporations, and other organizations that govern and structure society. By institutional racism or discrimination, we mean the unequal distribution of opportunities, rights, privileges, and resources to individuals or groups that results from the routine operation of society. For example, think of the tendency to underfund schools attended by large proportions of students of color, or the prevalence of law enforcement strategies that disproportionately target people of color, or the overrepresentation of white people in positions of political and economic power. Think of elected officials and corporate executives. And the set of laws, policies, practices, and organizations that shape who may rent or purchase property and where they can do so. Of course, where you live is really important, right? A home is more than just the bricks, paint, fence, etc. that make up your house or apartment. It's also the cultural and spiritual center of the family, where memories are made, where joys and sorrows are shared. Where you live is intimately connected to who you perceive yourself to be and to the resources, services, activities, and opportunities that you have access to. Owning a home is also a key way in which individuals and families can build up their wealth. In other words, where you live profoundly shapes your life chances. And the geography and dynamics of the housing market are stratified by race. We can think of three core processes through which race-based disparities have been built into the residential housing market. First, we have federal laws that were designed to keep African Americans from living near white families. One particular institution here was the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, which was established in the 1930s to help middle-class families purchase single-family homes by issuing loans with low interest rates and low down payments. These loans were a huge deal. For the first time in US history, many working and middle-class families were able to purchase homes. Now, the FHA, understandably, didn't want to issue risky loans, and so they had to come up with some way of determining which neighborhoods were worthy of these attractive mortgages and which weren't. Unfortunately, a huge determining factor was the racial composition of a neighborhood. Properties were thought to be too risky for these loans if they were located in racially mixed neighborhoods. And the FHA actually created maps that color-coded neighborhoods based on their level of risk and their racial composition. Here, for instance, is the map for the city of St. Louis in the US state of Missouri. Red meant the neighborhood was hazardous and not eligible for federal loans. Yellow meant the neighborhood was declining. Blue meant the neighborhood was desirable. And the best neighborhoods were shaded in green. At this time, in the middle of the 20th century, African Americans were pretty concentrated in the center part of the city. Those areas shaded red in the middle were upwards of 75 to 90% Black. Notice also the buffer of yellow, neighborhoods that still had relatively low proportions of Black residents, but that were located nearby neighborhoods with higher proportions, hence their FHA designation of declining. A second core process involved the private real estate industry, that is, banks and realtors. Banks generally followed the federal government's lead in not offering private home loans to African Americans, and realtors would steer African Americans away from predominantly white neighborhoods and whites away from predominantly Black neighborhoods. They would also engage in a practice called block busting. Here, they would scare white families into selling their homes for cheap by warning that African American families were moving into their neighborhood. How did they do this? Well, by hiring Black actors to, say, walk down the street or make phone calls to white families' homes asking for Black-sounding names. Finally, local neighborhood associations also had a number of tools at their disposal. They often drew up what are called restrictive covenants. These are terms written into property deeds that directly and explicitly prohibited the future sale of that property to racial minorities. And they also engaged in more informal tactics by protesting, picketing, or otherwise making their non-white neighbors feel unwelcome. So we had inscribed in the law, institutionalized by the state, and backed up by other organizations that make up the housing market, two distinct markets, one legitimate and backed by the government, the other lawless and patrolled by predators. Taken together, these processes help us understand how African Americans were systematically barred from the legitimate housing market in the US and from purchasing a home on the same favorable terms that were available to their white counterparts. These discriminatory policies and practices created a highly segregated patchwork of neighborhoods that persists in cities across the US. By segregation, we mean a kind of sorting, the physical separation of different groups, the extent to which racial groups live in different neighborhoods. A researcher in the US came up with a pretty smart way of illustrating just how segregated our cities are. He looked at census data, which allowed him to show where each and every individual in the US lives, and he color-coded individuals by their racial group. Here again is St. Louis in Missouri. One dot on this map represents each person, color-coded by their race. And you can clearly see geographic divisions by race. Black residents predominantly in the northern part of the city, white residents in the southern part of the city, and a pretty clear dividing line between the two. And we see this same pattern repeated across many cities in the US. Here's a similar map of Toronto. Residential segregation in Canada is different than in the US and perhaps a bit lower, but it exists here too. Okay, what did we learn? While individual prejudice and discrimination by individuals absolutely remains a problem, we also can't overlook the role that institutions play. That is, the ways in which discrimination is embedded in our laws, our policies, and our organizations. The housing market in the US provides a good example. And we've talked about how federal policies, the actions of banks and realtors, and neighborhood associations worked together to bar African Americans from certain neighborhoods and from purchasing homes on favorable terms. The segregation patterns created by this form of institutional discrimination have been long-lasting, and they're related to racial disparities in other areas like schooling and employment. More generally, though, this is an example of how sociology helps us dig deeper. We go beyond simply describing patterns of inequality. Sociology gives us a set of tools for better understanding where inequality in our society comes from and what we might do about it. To learn more about our program, be sure to check out our website. Thanks.